Alexander was born in July 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Macedonian kingdom in ancient Greece. At that time, he didn't yet carry the title of the Great. That's a title the world would give him later. We're talking about a kid. Well, not exactly, because this was a long time ago. Back then, there were no cameras, no photos, nothing like that. All we have left are some writings and sculptures made in his honor, which help us imagine what he might have been like. That's why, for this video, we're using dramatizations based on what's known about his life. Since these are such ancient historical events, not everything can be verified with 100% certainty. But what you'll hear next is what historians have pieced together so far. Alexander was the son of King Philip II of Macedon, a brilliant strategist from the Argead dynasty. At the time of Alexander's birth, Philip was in the process of unifying Greek territory. Because, yes, Greece was one of those civilizations that marked a before and after in art, philosophy, and architecture, but it was far from being a united country. It was a collection of city-states, called polis, like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, or Corinth. Each had its own government, laws, army, and even currency. And while they sometimes formed alliances, there were constant tensions, betrayals, and wars. But it wasn't always like that. About 100 years before Alexander's birth, all these cities managed to unite temporarily against a common enemy, the Persian Empire. From what is now Iran, the Persians tried to conquer Greece, and this threat led to legendary battles like Marathon and Thermopylae, where the Greeks fought together for the only time. But that unity was short-lived. Over time, old rivalries resurfaced, and after the Peloponnesian Wars, especially between Athens and Sparta, Greece was left deeply weakened, divided, and politically unstable. Philip saw an opportunity in this chaos. He strengthened the Macedonian kingdom with military reforms, including improvements to the phalanx, and intervened in the Greek city-states through wars, treaties, and strategic alliances, all with one goal: to unify Greece under his leadership. Yes, by force, but also to launch a military campaign against the Persians, the eternal enemy that remained a threat to Greece's peace. Alexander grew up in this divided Greece and, from a young age, was groomed to be a king. He was educated by the greatest teacher of the time, Aristotle, one of history's most important philosophers. With him, Alexander learned philosophy, science, ethics, politics, logic, and geography, everything a leader needed to understand the world. From his father, he learned other things: how to lead, how to think on the battlefield, how to design strategies, and how to command armies. From his mother, Olympias, he learned different things. She spoke to him about the gods, omens, dreams, and the Olympian gods who came down to earth to mingle with humans and even have children with them. In this mythology, one of the most important figures was Zeus, king of Olympus and father of many demigods who became heroes, like Perseus or Hercules. Then there were his brothers, Poseidon, king of the seas, and Hades, king of the underworld. This was important because, as Alexander conquered other lands, he knew how to navigate the gods of other religions and adapt with respect, so much so that he was even proclaimed pharaoh in Egypt. But we'll get to that later. From a young age, his mother told him he wasn't Philip's son, but Zeus's. According to legend, Olympias dreamed of a snake sliding over her body the night she became pregnant, and she interpreted it as a divine sign. So, she told Alexander he was a direct descendant of the gods. Plus, the Macedonian kings claimed to descend from Hercules, and Olympias's own family, the royalty of Epirus, claimed descent from Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. In other words, even within traditional genealogy, Alexander was seen as an heir to heroic blood, and his mother spoke of this with pride. It was as if, from the cradle, he was told he wasn't just any kid but the heir to a myth. Maybe that's why, from a young age, Alexander became obsessed with the heroes of Greek mythology, especially Achilles, whom he admired. And I find this pretty interesting because of what happens later, so it's important to know Achilles' story to understand what's coming. Achilles was born to a king and a sea goddess, making him a demigod. But his mother, who could see the future, knew Achilles had two possible paths: a long, quiet life without glory, or a short life immortalized in the memory of men. Thetis, as a mother who feared for her son, tried to change that fate. First, she tried to make him invulnerable by dipping him in the waters of the underworld's river, holding him only by the heel, which became his weak point. Later, when he grew up, she hid him to keep him from going to the Trojan War. But in Greek mythology, fate, or Moira, is above even the gods. Over the years, Achilles was trained by a centaur and became a warrior. Though he knew he'd die young if he fought, he also knew his name would live forever. So, he chose glory, becoming an unmatched and feared warrior. His name echoed across the world until one fateful day when an arrow struck his heel, and he died between the ages of 25 and 30, immortalizing his name and story. I want you to remember this story and this part of Alexander's childhood, shaped by his mother's tales, because it'll be important to understanding his story. However, as Alexander grew, the atmosphere at home got more complicated. Tensions arose when his father started marrying other women to form political alliances and expand his power. This was good for Macedon, but not for Alexander, because if another son was born, he could take the place that had been prepared for him since childhood. The throne wasn't inherited just by being the eldest. It required political support, strength within the royal family, and the nobility's acceptance. So, any new son of Philip became a threat. Alexander soon learned that nothing was guaranteed, and even within his own family, there could be rivals. And that would happen again later. Fortunately, Alexander wasn't alone in this environment. He became friends with Hephaestion, with whom he shared military training. They became very close friends, so close that even today, many believe they were more than just friends. Time passes, and now, at 18, Alexander is ready to prove what he's learned on the battlefield. His first big test is Chaeronea, a major confrontation against the Greek city-states resisting the invasion his father, Philip, had started. At Chaeronea, the Macedonian troops face an alliance led mainly by Athens and Thebes in an intense and decisive battle, where Alexander shows courage and strategy by leading his army, securing a victory that allows them to subdue both cities. With this, Philip imposes the League of Corinth, an alliance where Thebes, Athens, and Thessaly fall under his command, with Macedon as the dominant force, and only Sparta refuses to join. This is how Alexander earns respect and trust among Macedonian generals, who start to see him as a leader. But just as the young man is gaining weight as the heir, one of the king's new wives becomes pregnant, and it changes everything, because she's not just any wife. She's a Macedonian woman of noble blood, something Olympias, Alexander's mother, doesn't have, as she's from Epirus. In the logic of the court, this changes everything. The unborn child, if it's a boy, could be seen as a more legitimate heir, putting at risk everything Alexander has been building. It's said this situation sparked a heated argument between father and son that spiraled out of control, to the point that Alexander decided to leave the palace with his mother. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Persian Empire has been growing and, by then, has become the largest in the world, all under the command of Darius III. He controls a vast territory stretching from Egypt, one of its key pillars, through Asia Minor, Babylon, and all of Mesopotamia. To give you an idea, in today's geopolitics, it'd be like one country covering parts of Turkey, Iraq, eastern Syria, much of India, all of Iran, parts of Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and some areas of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. It's an empire that seems indestructible, and no one in their right mind dares challenge it. But that story is about to change. For nearly 2 years, Alexander stays away from the palace while his father prepares to conquer the Persian Empire. The estrangement ends when he and his mother return to attend the wedding of one of his sisters to a local monarch, and their presence seems to indicate the family conflict is behind them. The ceremony is grand, with nobles, soldiers, and diplomats in attendance. Philip enters accompanied by his personal guard, but suddenly, out of nowhere, one of them lunges at him and stabs him in front of everyone. King Philip is assassinated in the middle of the ceremony. This unleashes chaos and raises questions about who could be behind it. To this day, it's not known for sure who masterminded the crime. Some blame political enemies, others Olympias, and some even suspect Alexander, but nothing was ever proven. What was known at the time was that the one who stabbed him was Pausanias of Orestes. After this, Pausanias was captured and eliminated. What's clear is that, in the midst of the chaos, the young heir acts quickly. At just 20 years old, he gathers the main generals and secures his proclamation as the new king of Macedon. Meanwhile, his mother also acts. Alexander takes power head-on, and she, seemingly from the shadows, ensures no loose ends remain. According to historians who've tried to reconstruct what happened, Olympias ordered the death of Philip's young wife and the son she'd just had with the king to secure Alexander's throne. Some accounts say the woman took her own life, others that she was forced to, but the truth is that both mother and son disappeared, and with them, the only direct threat to Alexander's power. Thus begins Alexander's reign, convinced to continue what his father started, conquering Persia. The problem is that, as soon as he takes charge, he faces the first revolts. Some Greek cities, upon hearing of Philip's death, believed it was the perfect moment to reclaim their freedom. In response, Alexander subdues them. First Thessaly, then the Peloponnese, and finally, he reaches Thebes, where he devastates everything. He destroys all in his path, sells its inhabitants into slavery, and burns what he finds. This brutal show of force is enough to make the rest of the Greek cities surrender without a fight. Now, with control secured, he calls the League of Corinth and presents himself as the leader of the campaign, that is, as the supreme commander of all the Greeks. He gathers an army of about 40,000 soldiers and crosses the Hellespont into Asia Minor to begin one of the boldest campaigns in history, conquering the Persians. To give you an idea, at this point, the Persian Empire is so vast that it's divided into regions called satrapies. Each is governed by a satrap, like a local governor with significant power. These satraps manage their region's army, collect taxes, and administer justice, but they answer to the Persian king, Darius III. When the satraps learn Alexander is approaching, those in Asia Minor meet to plan a response. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek general working for Persia, advises them not to confront him directly. He suggests using tactics to wear down the Macedonians, cut off their resources, and leave them without supplies. But the satraps aren't willing to retreat without a fight. They trust their large number of soldiers and believe they can defeat him, so they decide to face him. Alexander doesn't take the usual route. He's been marching with his army toward Asia for 22 days and is already showing he doesn't think like others. Before entering battle, he detours to visit the ancient city of Troy, located in what is now Turkey. There, he pays homage at Achilles' tomb, the hero he admired since childhood. He offers a crown and performs a ritual in his honor, as if seeking not only protection but also to legitimize himself as his heir. The young man is about to begin the most ambitious campaign of his life, and he does so by invoking the memory of the greatest warrior in Greek mythology. Now, if we stop to think for a moment, Achilles' story sounds a bit strange. A kid dipped in the river of death to make him immortal, except for his heel, and raised by a centaur sounds unlikely. That Macedonian kings claim divine blood by descending from these heroes also sounds quite convenient. And dreaming that the most powerful god of Olympus comes down to earth and impregnates you, resulting in a demigod son, sounds nice, like a dream. While it's easy to think all this is absurdly fantastical to take as truth, we're looking at it with modern eyes from a distance of nearly 3,000 years. Back then, these stories weren't legends. They were history. They were reality. They were the great narratives that organized the world, the meta-narratives that gave meaning to things. For them, these stories were as true as the story of Mary giving birth as a virgin might be for a Catholic today. And when you understand it that way, it becomes fascinating to look at Alexander's story from that perspective, because then we can see how those myths didn't just recount the past, but also shape the future, forging beliefs, aspirations, and ideals. If back then the myth of Achilles told you what a hero should be, then that's what you aim to become. Just as someone in the West today might aspire to emulate Christ to gain the kingdom of heaven, Alexander aspired to emulate Achilles to earn a place in eternity, a perfectly normal goal, given his context and how that context shaped him. The clash between the Macedonians and the satraps takes place at the Granicus River, where the first major battle of this great campaign happens. When Alexander arrives, he finds the Persian army waiting for him on the other side of the river. In front, there's a cavalry of about 10,000 horsemen, and behind them, an infantry made up of thousands of Greek mercenaries. Yes, Greeks who switched to the Persian side. Memnon of Rhodes is also there, leading the mercenaries. They all try to stop Alexander, trusting the river will be enough to hold back the Macedonians. However, the young man organizes his army into 3 parts. On the left flank is the cavalry under Parmenian's command, a general who served under Philip in the past. In the center, Alexander places his father's perfected creation, the Macedonian phalanx. It's a tight formation of soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder, forming a kind of living wall. Each carries a small shield hung around the neck and a very long spear called a sarissa, which can measure between 4 and 6 meters. These spears protrude in several rows to the front, making it nearly impossible for the enemy to approach without being pierced. On the right flank, Alexander himself leads a second cavalry of elite soldiers alongside the most skilled archers. At first glance, everything is against him. The Persians outnumber him, and they're separated by a river. But Alexander is smarter than he seems. He was trained by Aristotle in critical thinking and learned strategy directly from his father, one of the greatest military minds of his time. Pay attention, because what he does in this battle is what starts to mark his name as one of history's most brilliant strategists. Alexander launches part of his cavalry through the shallowest part of the river. This provokes an immediate reaction from the Persians, who move to confront them. But as they advance, Macedonian archers greet them with a rain of arrows and javelins designed to be thrown from a distance, easing the cavalry's advance. Meanwhile, Alexander himself moves through the center to face the Persian cavalry head-on, where the main leaders of Asia Minor are. As the Macedonians manage to cross, the Persians do everything to push them back into the river. In the midst of the fight, Alexander is in danger. In fact, he nearly loses his life, but one of his men saves him just in time. This might seem reckless, sending the king to the toughest part of the battle, but beyond his strategy, while the Persians focus on that frontal fight, the rest of the Macedonian army advances from the left flank of the river. The phalanx, with its massive spears, forms an imposing wall that starts destroying everything in its path. The Persians can't hold and begin to flee. Everything happens so fast and with such precision that the Greek mercenaries in Persian service don't even get to fight. Alexander catches up to them before they escape, and though they're from his own land, he doesn't forgive their betrayal or spare their lives. All are executed. The Battle of Granicus marks Alexander's first great triumph. He now controls part of Asia Minor, proving he's ready to lead even against more numerous enemies. Still, the Persians remain very powerful, and though they may have underestimated him, they don't plan to repeat the mistake and are already preparing a new strategy to stop him. After this, Alexander advances toward coastal cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus, now Balad in Turkey, aiming to secure the area and cut off the Persian naval forces in the Mediterranean before moving deeper into the empire. The young man advances and takes the cities one by one. Some surrender without a fight, others resist but fall anyway. Along the way, they search for Memnon of Rhodes, the Greek general who fought at Granicus, as he poses a threat for future battles against the king. He knows their tactics and has Darius's full trust. Memnon manages to escape before being captured by Alexander, but dies soon after, though not at the Macedonian king's hands. According to Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, an expert on Alexander's life, Memnon died in combat while trying to recapture coastal cities for Persia, though others believe it was from illness. The truth is, with his death, Persia loses one of its most valuable generals, and Alexander faces fewer obstacles to securing the coast. Amid this journey, they reach the city of Gordium, where an ancient legend says that whoever unties a knot tied to an ancient king's chariot would be the rightful ruler of Asia. Many had tried, but none succeeded. When Alexander takes the city, he grabs his sword and cuts the knot with a single blow. This might seem like cheating, but the reality, or the message it sends, is that Alexander is willing to do whatever it takes to achieve what he wants, to take all of Persia. At this point, over a year has passed since the first battle, and Alexander's advance is starting to seriously worry Darius III. The territory he's conquered is significant, and when the young man reaches Syria, the Persian king decides to intervene personally before he reaches the heart of his empire. In fact, he's so confident that his presence as commander will ensure victory that he brings his entire family to the battlefield: his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statira, and his children. This might seem excessive today, but it wasn't that unusual for the Persians. In past victories, the royal family often watched the army's triumph from a tent or a nearby hill. But this time, Darius doesn't realize who he's up against. When Alexander arrives at Issus, the Persian army surprises him by attacking from the rear. It's the first time he faces Darius III directly. The Persian king tries to surround him through the mountains and cut off his supply line, forcing him to retreat. But in the process, he makes a key mistake. He chooses a terrain too narrow between the sea and the mountains, which prevents the full deployment of his massive army. In that confined space, not all his men can fight at once, significantly reducing his numerical advantage. The battle begins in that narrow pass. Darius believes the location gives him an advantage because it forces the Macedonians to fight in tough conditions. Plus, his army outnumbers them nearly 2-1. This time, he places his best cavalry on the right, near the sea, where the terrain favors horses. In the center, he puts Greek mercenaries at the front of the formation. On the left, he places the Persian infantry, and he stays in the rear, surrounded by his personal guard of about 10,000 men. Alexander repeats the strategy he used at Granicus. He places the Macedonian cavalry near the sea under Parmenian's command and the phalanx in the center. He takes position on the right flank with his elite cavalry, archers, and spearmen near the mountains. The battle starts with the clash of cavalries by the sea. The Persians have numerical superiority, so Alexander sends reinforcements from his flank. Meanwhile, he advances steadily with the phalanx, facing the Greek mercenaries in the center. The Macedonian offensive is so strong that it starts breaking the enemy lines. Alexander then charges toward the center, where Darius is, but before reaching him, the Persian king, seeing his troops losing ground, decides to flee the battlefield. In his escape, he abandons his chariot, his treasure, his wife, his daughters, and his mother, who are captured by the Macedonians. However, Alexander orders they be treated with respect and dignity, strengthening his image as a just leader before his soldiers and the world. This is, without a doubt, a great victory, but not the last, because winning a battle isn't the same as winning a war. And this war will lead them to face each other again in an even bigger battle, the one I mentioned at the start. After the victory, Alexander takes the Persian camp and captures Darius's family. According to Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, he uses this power to his advantage. When Darius learns of this, he offers a huge sum of money and the territories Alexander has already conquered to get them back. It's a hard offer to refuse. His friend Parmenion advises him to accept it. After all, they've won. But the Persians still have superior numbers, resources, and territory. However, Alexander rejects it all. His plan continues, and instead of pursuing Darius or returning to Macedon, he decides to head to Egypt. On the way, he takes the coastal cities one by one, which takes about 6 months, leaving behind bodies, fire, and slaves. When Alexander arrives at Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt, his men look at him with concern. The region is still under Persian control, but it's also one of the empire's most valuable areas. It has an ancient culture, fertile lands, and significant food production. However, Alexander knows history and understands that this battle isn't won by force alone. Since the 6th century BC, the Persians had dominated Egypt. At first, they tried to integrate, but over time, They imposed high taxes, installed governors alien to the local culture, and treated Egypt like a province to exploit. This created resentment, especially in a people with such a strong religious and cultural identity. Being ruled by someone who didn't share their beliefs was a humiliation. Alexander understands this and knows that if he manages to enter, he'd gain control of the resources and break one of the pillars of Persian power. So, when he arrives in Egypt, he presents himself as an ally. He promises respect for their customs and the possibility of self-governance without foreign pressure. Surprisingly, this approach makes him a liberator, and the cities surrender without a fight. Not only that, they welcome him with open arms. The acceptance is so strong that they proclaim him pharaoh. In Egypt, being pharaoh isn't just becoming king. It's being seen as a sacred figure, the representative of the gods on earth. Before him, that role was held by figures like Ramses II or Thutmose III, an essential part of Egyptian religion and soul. But now, a young Macedonian is seen as the new embodiment of that millennia-old tradition. And, of course, Alexander accepts the title with honor, because it seems that's what he was destined to be, a kind of demigod. Okay, by now we've understood how meta-narratives can shape many parts of our lives, our aspirations, and our beliefs, but we've only talked about theological ones. So, to better understand Alexander's case, it's worth mentioning them as cultural factors. These appeal more to the human plane and mark what a culture considers ideal, valuable, or desirable in the tangible world. Many aren't so obvious, but they do shape much of how we navigate the world. In Alexander's case, and situating ourselves in that historical moment, an important meta-narrative at the heart of ancient Greek society was a concept called kleos. In its most basic form, it can be translated as glory, but for figures like Alexander, it's a term referring to the pursuit and celebration of glorious actions, which, at that time, were mainly achieved on the battlefield. Those who aspired to kleos had to leave everything behind: their comfort, their loved ones, even their lives. And those who achieved it were considered heroes and became immortal through the memory of their deeds. It wasn't just any fame. For the Greeks, kleos was a kind of glory that could only be earned through courage, virtue, and actions so extraordinary they could become legendary. Basically, achieving immortality through the eternal fame of one's actions. Knowing this, it's easy to see why Alexander didn't settle for just a few battles. He wanted it all because it was what he saw as his duty his entire life. And though that was thousands of years ago, we're not exempt from these same conditions. Because, while the symbols have changed, we still live within stories that tell us what it means to live well, what it means to succeed, and what's worth pursuing. I'll explain why at the end. The conquest of Egypt is a direct blow to Darius III, who loses one of the most valuable regions of his empire. While he tries to reorganize to face Alexander, he suffers another loss. His wife, Statira, still in captivity, dies. With the queen's death, the Persian Empire begins to crumble even faster. Alexander, for his part, settles in Egypt and founds a coastal city he calls Alexandria, the first of many he'll establish as he advances through the Persian Empire. It's located in a fishing area with direct access to the Mediterranean, near the Nile Delta, and connected by trade routes. From the start, it became a center of trade, culture, and power thanks to its natural port, which facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and people. The city was planned to his liking, with wide streets, temples, public buildings, and, later, the Library of Alexandria, which would gather the knowledge of the ancient world. At this point, Alexander is already king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, and commander of one of the most efficient armies of his time. In just a few years, he went from securing his throne to ruling vast territories that once belonged to the world's largest empire. But as he expands his dominion eastward, things get complicated in Greece. Many Greeks start to see him as a tyrant, someone threatening the freedom of the city-states. Sparta decides to act and organizes a revolt to break free from Macedonian control. However, facing Alexander's army isn't easy. The Macedonians are now an imposing force with well-trained soldiers and iron discipline. The rebellion creates tensions in other Greek cities, divided between supporting Sparta or staying allied with Macedon, generating a climate of political instability. Alexander must maintain his authority from afar and keep internal control without losing sight of his ambition to keep conquering. Despite attempts to challenge him, they fail to defeat him. 2 years pass, and during that time, Darius reorganizes and gathers a new army, much larger than the previous one. He assembles troops from all regions of the empire: infantry, cavalry, war chariots, elite mercenaries, and even elephants. He knows the next battle will be decisive, so he puts everything on the table. Before facing him again, he tries to negotiate. He offers Alexander half the empire, a marriage alliance with one of his daughters, and a lot of money. Anyone else would have hesitated, but Alexander doesn't want half. He wants it all and is willing to advance until he gets it. Finally, the great battle that will define who is the greatest conqueror of their time arrives. The two armies face off on the plain of Gaugamela, a place chosen by Darius, who even prepared it in advance to gain an advantage. He orders the terrain to be cleared and leveled so his war chariots can move freely. Darius arrives with everything. Between 200,000 and 300,000 men, a massive force of cavalry, infantry, blade-equipped chariots, and war elephants. Alexander, on the other hand, arrives with a much smaller army of about 40,000 soldiers and 7,000 cavalry, but his men are united, trained, have real experience, and complete trust in their leader. What Alexander does in this battle is very interesting. The tactics he used before against Darius were similar, so the Persian king likely expected something similar. He prepares a special response for the Macedonian formation. And yes, Alexander uses his classic formation again, cavalry on the flanks and the phalanx at the front. But this time, the strategy changes. Instead of attacking head-on, he advances diagonally. At the same time, he orders a charge on the opposite flank, where the Persian defense is weaker. The idea is to divide the enemy and break their order. Darius, noticing the movement, stretches his lines to cover the front, but this weakens his center. At that moment, Alexander changes course and launches a direct attack on the heart of the Persian army. When the battle begins, the war chariots advance to the front. The Macedonian light infantry opens up, lets them pass, and then surrounds them. Meanwhile, the pressure on the right flank keeps working. Darius is forced to move more units, further weakening his central line. That's when the final blow comes. The heavy cavalry breaks through the Persian center. The chariots fail to break through, the elephants have no room to advance, and the soldiers start to fall apart. Darius, seeing Alexander approaching, flees for the second time, leaving behind his army and any chance of regaining control. The result is a total victory for Alexander. Gaugamela marks the end of Persian power. The victorious army enters the main cities without resistance and takes control of the territory. Darius flees eastward, marking the end, at least, of the heart of the Persian Empire. However, some regions still remain loyal to him. So, Alexander decides to pursue and eliminate him to become the legitimate king of all Persians. He chases him for days, crossing mountainous and desert areas. When they finally find him, Darius has already been killed by one of his own satraps, something that probably left Alexander with a sense of emptiness, because after chasing him so long, he couldn't be the one to end this story. With the king's death, Alexander becomes the legitimate king of Persia. His first order is to bury Darius alongside his ancestors as a gesture of humanity. With this victory, he focuses on governing. He's now king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, and lord of the entire former Persian Empire. What follows is conquest after conquest. The next cities resist at first, but he manages to take them one by one. At first, you might think that, having achieved his goal, he'd return to Macedon, but that's not the case. Alexander appoints trusted people as governors in the most important cities and focuses on marrying, mainly to strengthen ties with each Persian city. But he never returns to Macedon. In fact, he founds another 11 Alexandrias across the territory, cities that retain some Greek culture but signal that he has no intention of going back, as he now has another goal: India. Thus begins the campaign. The problem is that, amid this expansion, he starts making decisions that unsettle his own men. He adopts Persian clothing, demands to be treated as a divine figure, and drifts away from his roots. His old generals, now governors, see him differently. Some still admire him, others no longer recognize him. This inevitably leads to conflicts with others who try to harm him. The son of General Parmenion is one of the first accused of conspiring against him, and Alexander doesn't hesitate for a second. He orders his execution and that of his father, Parmenion, the trusted man who was with him in all the battles that got him where he is now. It seems that achieving what he pursued for so long, power, transforms him. From a charismatic leader, he becomes a feared man, paranoid about the possibility of being assassinated. Though he keeps crossing borders to conquer, remaining undefeated, his army loses motivation. In his quest to conquer India, they reach the Indus River and defeat King Porus. But his troops refuse to keep conquering. They don't want to advance further, seem exhausted, and haven't returned home in years. For the first time, Alexander agrees to stop. He gives the order to return. They cross the Gadrosian Desert toward Persia, losing men, supplies, and animals along the way. Upon arriving back in Babylon, Alexander learns that Hephaestion has died, his closest companion and perhaps his greatest love. Because of this, Alexander is devastated, orders a monumental funeral, sacrifices thousands of animals, and declares himself a divine figure. After that, some say he was never the same. Exactly 1 year after Hephaestion's death, in 323 BC, the great Alexander falls gravely ill. A fever consumes him for days until, at just 32 years old, the king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, and great king of Persia leaves this world. The causes of his death are still unclear, but what's known, thanks to historians who've studied his life in depth, is that it could have been an infection, a final battle that defeated the man who conquered the world, worsened by years of campaigns. His body was embalmed following the tradition of Egyptian pharaohs and taken to Alexandria, the first city he founded. However, to this day, his tomb hasn't been found. After conquering a gigantic empire, Alexander never returned to Macedon. Though he inherited the family throne, his gaze was always set eastward, and he never really cared about governing his homeland. This resulted in his empire being left without a clear leader after his death. The power vacuum he leaves is enormous. His son, Alexander IV, hasn't been born yet, and his half-brother, Philip III Aridius, has disabilities that prevent him from ruling. So, Alexander's closest generals take control. At first, they try to keep the empire together, governing in the name of the heirs, but ambition and differences end up dividing them. Each general starts taking their share of the territory and acting on their own. Ptolemy takes Egypt and founds a dynasty that lasts nearly 300 years. Seleucus rules Asia, from Syria to Persia, founding the Seleucid Empire. Cassander controls Macedon and Greece, while Lysimachus takes Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. This meant that Alexander's great dream of uniting East and West came to an end. Over time, these Hellenistic kingdoms competed and fought each other, weakening any influence a unified empire might have had. Eventually, centuries later, the Romans arrived and, with their military and administrative power, conquered and absorbed these fragmented territories. It was they who ultimately dubbed him Alexander the Great. Alexander conquered almost everything he set out to. He founded cities, crossed deserts, and assembled impossible armies, carrying his name to the farthest corners of the known world. But after his death, his empire crumbled. The generals who once followed him fought each other for power. His hometown fell into chaos, and he never returned to it. There were betrayals, deaths, senseless conflicts, and yes, his story remains impressive. Whether it was worth it for him, no one can say otherwise. But it's also true that, deep down, Alexander was a manifestation of the meta-narratives he grew up with. He was shaped by them, by the myth of Achilles, by eternal glory, by the idea that it was better to die young and be remembered than to live long and go unnoticed. And though today, centuries later, we might see these meta-narratives as things of the past, the truth is we're also immersed in others. We no longer talk about gods or battlefield glory, but we still guide our lives by stories that tell us what it means to succeed, what it means to live well, what's worth sacrificing. The problem is we don't always see them, and sometimes, without realizing it, we become reflections of those ideas we don't question but that condition us. For example, there's the idea that science is the only valid way to understand the world, or romantic love with its promise that there's someone destined for you who'll complete you. There's also the narrative of the nation that makes us feel part of a great imaginary family, or the narrative that turns youth into the pinnacle of life, as if everything that comes after is loss or decline, and that economic success equals personal worth. Today, we don't measure greatness by how many territories you conquer, but by how much money you make, how much attention you get, or how high you climb the professional ladder. We don't kill enemies, but we sacrifice time, health, or relationships to achieve what's expected. And it's not wrong to have goals. The important thing is to ask, where do these goals come from? Those narratives that guide us, are they really ours? Do they do us good? Do they make sense for us? Because if they do, if they bring us peace, if they give us direction, if we choose them consciously, maybe that's okay. But if not, if we just follow them because that's how it's supposed to be, then maybe it's worth stopping for a moment and daring to build our own.